Good noon. Todavía es día o no. Puede decir buenos días o no. No, ya es tarde, ¿no? Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. As the young lady said, my name is Ernesto Cortés, Jr. I'm the National Co-Director of the Industrial Areas Foundation, which is the Saul David Alinsky Training Institute. What I do is teach people how to organize, primarily through institutions. Organizing is a fancy word for building what we call public relationships, relationships of trust, which enable people who tend to be left out, who tend to be discarded, who tend to be humiliated, teach them how to assert themselves in an effective way so that they can make an impact on institutions, governmental institutions, nonprofit institutions, but also enterprises. So the job of an organizer, we don't call it community organizing anymore because the organizing that we do is institutionally based. It's always connected to an institution, a congregation, a mosque, a synagogue, a school, a health clinic, a nonprofit, a settlement house, a collection of business leaders and labor unions, teacher organizations. Any institution which is committed to the vision and values of a democratic society. Any institution which is connected to real people, people who have interests, who have grievances, have difficulties, have challenges. So our job, if you will, is to build what we call an organization of organizations, to bring together those institutions to effectively bring about change. Slow, patient, deliberate change. All of our organizers have got to read a book written by a guy named Charles Payne called I've Got the Light of Freedom. And one of the chapters in that book is entitled Slow and Patient Work and talks about the work that was done in the civil rights movement in the Mississippi Delta. Anybody read the book? Why did you read the book? Who assigned it to you? I did. Okay, all right, okay. That doesn't count. How come anybody else read the book? Who didn't get it, who was not assigned to it by me? All right, okay. Well, you assign it to them, okay? At least the relevant chapters. Because the book talks about the kind of work that we try to teach, which is a slow and patient work of building relationships, a relationship of trust. We make a big distinction between organizing and mobilizing. Mobilizing is what Occupy America did. Mobilizing is what a lot of groups did. Unfortunately, we thought they were going to do successful organizing in places like the Arab Spring in Egypt, but unfortunately it ended up being much more, my incorrect, mobilization. Sadly, it was not organizing, and as a result, things went awry because there was no teaching, there was no mentoring, there was no creation of an institutional relationship that could enable people to begin to develop multiple understandings of their personhood. We are not just one thing. We are male and female. We are liberal conservative. We are Catholic and Protestant. We are all things to all people, okay? I think a Jewish fellow by the name of Paul of Tarsus said that, okay? Is that what he said? Okay. So I'm a Greek to the Greeks, a Roman to the Romans, a Hebrew to the Hebrews, okay, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that we have to have that capacity to be multiple selves, to be able to understand life, if you will, meaning through the personhood of others, because that's what it means to become a person, as over against an isolated, disconnected individual. You have the capacity to step outside of yourself and see the world through other people's situation. Not impose your vision on them, not try to be empathetic and tell you what I think you're thinking, what your pain is all about, but rather find out what your pain is all about by listening, attentive listening over time, because you're not going to tell me the truth until you begin to trust me. You're not going to disclose who you really are until we build that kind of trust. So there has to be that dimension in all the work that we do. Now, I've got a very long and very well-written paper to give you, which would take me an hour and a half to read, which you don't have time to listen to. So I'm going not to do this. And if you want to see it, I'm going to ask some of our leaders here to make it available to you, and because it's very exciting and very thoughtful and very woven together. But it would be boring for me to do that, to read this paper. So I'm not. But I'm going to try to pick up a few things here which make some sense, and I'm going to ask Kristen King here to help me stay on the straight and narrow and make sure that I don't talk past 12:35, because I'd like to get all of you into the conversation. And I would really enjoy having you either ask me questions or make comments or push back at anything that I say. Okay. America's in trouble. Very serious trouble. And you have to be an idiot, disconnected, Rip Van Winkle on Mars, just come from Mars, not to know that, okay? And even the most optimistic, sanguine people say the country is in trouble. It's never been more polarized than it is today. And quite frankly, most people would acknowledge that the American dream is over with. There's a guy named Garfinkel who wrote a book, which also is required reading, called The American Dream and the Gospel of Wealth. I don't know if you read that book or not. Anybody here read that book? Did you read that book? Parts of it. Do you remember what it said?
I'd rather hear it from you.
Okay, all right, okay. Well, the hero of the American dream is Abraham Lincoln. Because Lincoln thought that the role of the public sector, of government, was to clear the path. And Lincoln's ideal was that a man worked for wages, a woman worked for wages, they saved up enough money to buy tools, and then after a while, they would be able to go into business for themselves and then hire other people. So there was this kind of dynamic upward mobility. And Lincoln, when he became president, did several things to kind of articulate or incarnate that dream. One was the Morrill Act of 1862. Anybody know what that was all about? Land grant college, create land grant college. Harry Truman is famous once because he said when Senator Fulbright, I think it was from this state, said that in the parliamentary system, because the Republicans control both houses of Congress, okay, Truman would have to resign. And then someone asked Truman what he thought of Senator Fulbright's remarks, and he said, well, the only comment I have to make about Senator Halfbright is that I wish he had had a land grant college education, okay? That would cure him, okay? Unfortunately, Fulbright had gone to the University of Arkansas, okay? So he had been the beneficiary of a land grant college education, okay? Notwithstanding Harry Truman's intemperate remarks. Anyway, so the Morrill Act created schools like the University of Arkansas, schools like Texas A&M, which I'm a graduate of, okay? All over the country. Oklahoma State was also a land grant college. So all over the country, the Morrill Act created those kind of universities, those public universities, which are meant for working people to be able to attend. Lincoln also passed legislation which gave 160 acres to anybody who had settled. And the requirement for that was that you be willing to work the land and not have taken up arms against the United States government, which meant who was excluded? Confederates. Because they had taken up arms, anybody who had taken up arms against the United States government was excluded. Because Lincoln understood, okay, that there had to be an end to slavery, and he was trying to create incentives for people from the South to want to be on the side of being anti-slavery. And that was one way to do that, to give away land to people who refused to take up arms against the U.S. government during the Civil War. He wasn't a perfect human being. I'm not going to deny his racist dimension. He grew up, after all, in Kentucky. He grew up in a slave state. He was not, and he was only frankly convinced of equality by the suffering and the pain and the courage of African American soldiers who could not, who the war could not have been won by the Union without them. Frederick Douglass grew to admire Lincoln, but he felt much more comfortable, ironically, with one of his successors, Ulysses Grant, who he felt was a true patriot, okay, and a true believer in equality. So we have this dream, this American dream, which is the idea that people will do well, that my daughters, my son will do better than I do. My grandchildren will do better than I do. That dream is over. Roger Altman, who's no liberal, former U.S. Deputy Treasury Secretary under Bill Clinton, has said that the American workers have had zero wage increases for the last 40 years. He quotes a Federal Reserve Board survey of households that 46% of U.S. adults could not put together $400 for an emergency without going into debt or selling an asset. 80% of the children born in 1980 will not earn more than their parents. Class mobility has been declining for 40 years. So part of the reason, and Altman wrote this article as a way of saying, if you think the election of Donald Trump was an anomaly, think again. Think again. Why? Because there's a whole group of people, white, Latino, African American, who feel passed by, who feel resentful, who feel humiliated, who feel that people who live on both coasts, East Coast, West Coast, have no idea what's going on in their lives and could care less. One author quoted that Hillary Clinton should have used the word that Victor Hugo used, les miserables, to describe the people that she thought were voting for Trump, because they are the people who are left out. They are the poorest of the poor. Now, I know she said that everybody took that out of context, okay? I know she's not a bad person, but nonetheless, there are a group of people around her and around both political parties, the elites of both political parties, who have no idea of the struggle that working people are going through. If they did, and I'm including the last president of the United States, they would not have bailed out Wall Street and leave Main Street behind. We were working in Las Vegas, North Las Vegas, Clark County, which was the epicenter, okay, of the mortgage foreclosure crisis. Could not get HUD to put together, even when Harry Reid was Senate Majority Leader, could not get HUD to put together a strategy to deal with the fact that so many people were losing their homes or underwater. In Los Angeles, one of our clergy discovered a family, asked him to come and bless their home because they were going to be foreclosed on, okay, in 10 days. Because they had been seduced into getting a subprime loan, had not read the fine print, and did not realize that there was going to be a balloon payment and that their mortgage was going to go up to $3,600 a month, which was unaffordable for them. Now, I have a lot of stories that I'd like to tell. One particular one, which comes out of our organizing, which Chris was involved in. Chris King was involved. Would you stand? Be recognized? In Oklahoma City. Well, maybe I ought to ask you to tell the story. Well, it's your story. All right. I feel like a fraud telling her story when she's here, okay? But I'll tell it, all right. But I'm going to remind you of this, okay? I once did a presentation for Cornell West, and Tavis Smiley was in the audience. And he said, I was bored when you started, but then I got excited about it because I did Moses and Jethro and taught the iron rule off of that story. And he said, I'm going to steal it from you. And I said to him, that's fine, but just tell people where you got it. He said, I'm going to tell you what my old professor said. The first time I'm going to say, as Ernesto Cortés said. The second time I'm going to say, as I've heard it said. And the third time I'm going to say, as I've always said. Okay. So be careful of letting me steal your story. But anyway, the IF affiliate in Oklahoma City and the Oklahoma Education Association spent 6 months engaging over 2,000 parents, teachers, community leaders, and students about the impact of testing on the schools and on their lives. They learned that only 100 out of 173 school days per year were actually available for instruction. Did I say that carefully?
The rest was all on testing and pre-testing.
Yep. I told you, she's got the better angle of the vision. But anyway, the rest of the days, there was 173 days that kids went to school. 100 of those were for instruction. The rest were pre-testing and testing. They were outraged because the kids were not receiving a quality education. Principals could get fired if students or teachers misplaced more than one test. And nobody was consulting them. So after 6 months of working together with the superintendent, 1,500 voice leaders assembled to ask the state superintendent candidates to respond to what they learned. 5 out of the 7 candidates participated in the assembly to face the people. The incumbent, who was protesting and basically against public education, didn't show up. Fortunately, she got unelected. The voters chose not to return her to public office. And the organization was there and in a position to work with the elected superintendent to modify those things. Now, things are not perfect, but they're better. The same thing, I can tell you story after story in San Antonio, where citizens are being asked to pay an enormous amount of money for a nuclear power plant, which supposedly was going to only add $100 a month to their energy bills. They did research and found out that no, the reality was they were paying more than $300 a month because their homes were not energy efficient. So instead of getting the nuclear power plant to be purchased by the city, they got a program for refurbishing the homes, for fixing the homes, so they could become much more energy efficient. Story after story we can talk about, whether it's in Los Angeles, Oklahoma, San Antonio, the living wage fight, Baltimore. All of them really involve the same process. How do we identify leaders? Leaders who have social knowledge, leaders who have tacit knowledge, or what the Greeks call metis, knowledge that they don't know they have. Knowledge that can only be acquired through them reflecting with other people about their knowledge. Walter Brueggemann, in a book called Hope Within History, talks about one of the steps in hope is for people to first cry out their pain, but then secondly, to figure out, is there some mechanism for processing that pain and making that pain articulate? And that's what we do when we organize. You listen to people, you hear their story, you hear their pain, you get them to talk to other people, and through that process, they begin to share their experience, find out they're not the only ones who are going through this. And then they begin to want to think about, how do I understand this better, more effectively? Then they're willing to listen to experts and ask questions of experts and challenge the opinions of experts. We're not against expert knowledge. We are against experts who impose their expertise on people. There's a guy named William Easterly who wrote a book called The White Man's Burden. Anybody ever read the book? Anybody heard of the book? Did you read the book? You remember what he talks about in the beginning of the book? The difference between planners and seekers? What are planners? The gentleman next to you seems like he knows what I mean by that. They're the experts. They got the knowledge, okay? And they want to impose that knowledge on ordinary people without, first of all, figuring out what their interests are, what their situation is, what their context is, what do they really care about. It's like a school reformer trying to impose a curriculum on people who are concerned primarily about the safety of their kids. Will their kids come back home safe? Don't talk to me about curriculum. Don't talk to me about testing. I want to know, is my child going to come home safe? Or is she going to be dropped off by a bus at a dangerous intersection in Los Angeles, which was happening to children of Jewish congregations? And so they had 700 people come together after going through this kind of process to get the school superintendent to change the location of where the buses were dropping kids off. Then we'll talk. We do something about that, then we'll talk. So that's what you have to do if you're going to organize people. You got to figure out what is in their interest, what are they concerned about. Then you can begin to stir their imagination and get them thinking, well, maybe there's something else we ought to be doing to make this school not only safe, but effective and important. We have a mantra: power precedes program. Power precedes program. What does that mean? You look very intelligent, sir. No, the gentleman who's writing notes. No, you're not the one I think looks very intelligent. The young man without a tie in front of you. Yes, sir. What does that sound like? Power precedes program. Are you intelligent? You look intelligent. What do you think that means? I'll give you a hint. You can have all kinds of ideas. You can have all kinds of solutions, all kinds of programs, but they're not worth a tinker's dam unless you got the power to implement them. Franklin Roosevelt used to say to people, okay, you've convinced me. Don't try to convince me anymore. Go out and organize and create the constituency that's going to make me do it, because I'm not going to commit political suicide. My interest is getting re-elected. My interest is being able to move legislation through the Congress. So I'm not going to go off on a wild idea which there's no political constituency to back me up and support me. He did some wild things occasionally and got beat back for it, and then he learned. So there's a lot of things you want to do. I want to do. A lot of radical ideas, okay, I've got. But they only make sense if there's an organized constituency that understands the ideas, cares about the ideas, and cares about the ideas because it's in their interest. Now, we organize people around their interests. But that does not mean we organize people to be selfish. Alexis de Tocqueville, one of the great observers of American politics, when he came to the United States to study democracy in America and wrote his book, he talked about what makes American democracy work is they have a concept of self-interest, what he called self-interest properly understood, which was a relational understanding. The word interest comes from the Latin word inter esse, which means to be among or between. And de Tocqueville was impressed to the extent that people in the United States working through what he called intermediate institutions of family and congregation and neighborhoods, that they were able then to engage the public institutions of township, school board, and citizenship. Even though they were concerned about national elections, the politics that really mattered to them was at the local level, because that's where their schools were built, that's where their roads were built, that's where their communities, that's where their criminal justice system functioned. And he was particularly impressed by the ability of women to run those institutions, and how smart they were, and how they would curb the worst inclinations of the male members of their families. Now, one of the things that I want to leave here today is to talk to you about one of the things that I've most enjoyed about organizing is unleashing the power, the energy, the anger of mothers who care about their kids and grandmothers who care about their grandchildren. A priest told me once, he said, you don't have to ever convince me about IAF. He said, because I went to an action in San Antonio, and I saw a grandmother pinning City Councilman Walter Martinez. And after the action was over, they came over and they were thrilled, and they just loved her. They would talk about how wonderful she was, etc. He said, everywhere you see grandparents, and I got pictures of showing off their grandchildren. But this is the only organization I see where grandchildren are showing off their grandparents, admiring their grandparents, looking to their grandparents for guidance, for role models. He says, you don't have to convince me about the value of this kind of work. It's transformational in the way in which it affects families and its impact on families. Now, if we have time, another time, I'd like to tell you a lot about cunning. You can't be a good organizer unless you're cunning. I think in one of the Gospels it says, be ye wise as serpents. Now, why would Jesus of Nazareth tell his disciples to be wise as a serpent? Because the serpent is what? A symbol for what? Huh? Cunning. Cunning. Okay? So he's telling people, be wise as a serpent, but innocent as a dove, okay? So you have to understand the power of self-interest. Reinhold Niebuhr wrote a book called The Children of Light and the Children of Darkness. And essentially he said, if you really want to understand what Jesus was saying, he was saying, why do I get the dumb guys? Why are my disciples so stupid, so innocent, so lacking in cunning? Would that the children of light were as wise in this generation as the children of darkness, I think is what this is. You got to have people who are smart, who are cunning. In Matthew's gospel, the genealogy of Christ. Anybody know the genealogy of Christ in Matthew's gospel? Who is in the genealogy? There are 4 women. You know who they are? Tamar, the daughter-in-law of Judah. Remember Tamar? What she did? She seduced her father-in-law. Got him to give up his staff and his... What else? Huh? Ruth's there. Foreigner. Moabite. Rahab, the prostitute of Jericho. And Bathsheba, wife of Uriah the Hittite. 4 women. All of them foreigners. All of them outcasts. All of them considered disreputable. And they're right there smack in the genealogy in Matthew's gospel. Because he's telling the disciples, don't be so stupid. Don't be so self-righteous. You've got to be willing to be inclusive. And that means looking for people who are at the margin of life. In Matthew 25, it says, I was a stranger and you took me in. The word to take in comes from the Greek word synagogo. It doesn't mean to bring into your household. It means to bring into full participation of the life of the synagogue community, which was a community of prayer and worship, but also of education and deliberation. The word in Hebrew for synagogue is knesset, which is ironically the term used for the Israeli parliament, the Bet Knesset. So you're talking about creating space for people to participate fully in public life. I'm out of time. So I'll end with the Pledge of Allegiance. Is there a flag here? Okay, so let's all pledge, okay? I pledge allegiance. Can you do that for me? You can stand if you want to, okay? You can kneel if you want to. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now, sit down. You pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands. Republic comes from the Greek. Is it Greek or Latin, Ramon? Latin word, res publica. What does res publica mean? The public thing. The public thing. The flag stands for the public thing. The public thing is the space that we create for people to do politics, the space that we create for people to deliberate, to learn how to argue with each other, how to negotiate with each other. Without that public thing, we have tyranny. And we're losing that public thing because of the bifurcation of our working class. We're losing the public thing because of the polarization in our society. We're losing our public thing because we no longer have institutions which enable people to deliberate, to argue. And that's why we create broad-based organizations. That's why we organize. That's why we agitate. That's why we organize. That's why we agitate. And that's why we teach people to have power, because right now, organized money's got organized people on the run, and we're not going to turn it around unless we begin to build powerful institutions which teach people how to organize. Thank you.
All right. Take questions. Okay, we have time for questions, so if you have any questions, please raise your hand and we'll get the microphone to you. Shirley, there's a question right over here, and the microphone's coming.
Thank you so much. My question is around self-interest. And I think perhaps those of us who are advocates, we think we know what is in the best interest of others.
That's right.
And we're often wrong about that.
Usually we are.
But
ask your children.
However, there are some pieces of, for example, some folks will say, well, you're going to get a tax cut. But the average person may not understand that that tax cut comes at the expense of their child's education, health care, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we make that strategic argument to help folks find what their enlightened self-interest really is in that scenario?
Well, we faced that a number of times in Texas, where there were proposals, okay, for different forms of taxation, and essentially what we did was organize what we call civic academies, where we would go out and get 50, 60, 70 people to attend a civic academy, lay out what the proposal called for, and make it understandable in terms that people could understand, okay? And I've seen that happen a number of times. When the shrub cut taxes, okay? People did not understand that the tax cuts came out of the surplus, which was created because people were paying into the Social Security system because the Social Security taxes had been increased, and because people who are undocumented were paying into that Social Security system. So there was a huge surplus in existence. But most of the surplus, not all of it, but most of the surplus came from, again, the people who make less than, at that time, was it $90,000 a year? And they're paying into the payroll tax because they didn't increase the percentage of the payroll tax in order to make it solvent. And so he took that money and gave it to rich people. And no one said anything about it. And Democrats caved in, and et cetera. So the problem is, we have a situation where both political parties are in hock to the financial interests. Otherwise, they would not support the kind of inordinate interest payments that you have to pay for credit card. What used to be loan sharking is now legal. And some of the people who support Democratic candidates give lots of money to Democratic are the people who are proposing that kind of legislation, which means we have now become a nation whose most important product, besides guns, is debt. We make debt instruments. We sell debt, student debt, mortgage debt, all kinds of debt. Okay, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
Got off my soapbox.
Other questions? Anybody else have a question?
Did that answer your question, by the way? Okay.
All right.
If I don't answer your question, come back at me.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yes,
ma'am.
Got a question back there.
It kind of goes off what was just said.
Come up just a little bit so I can hear you.
Like stand here?
I'm a little bit.
I'll just project to the microphone.
Thank
How's
you.
that? Okay, great. I was listening to NPR the other day.
Oh, that's a mistake.
Yeah, well.
I'm teasing.
They were interviewing people in Pittsburgh about Trump. And the woman that was being interviewed was essentially, my 401k is fine, so I'm not concerned about anything changing. So when we're talking about self-interest and the things that personally matter to me, if it doesn't matter to someone else in that they're only interested in their 401k and not what is happening in the country, what do you do about that?
Well, that's why you shouldn't listen to NPR.
Well, I was sad
okay.
afterwards.
I listen to NPR and I like them, but the problem with that kind of interview is that people don't know what they're thinking. They're just trying to say something which sounds halfway intelligent, okay? And most times they're trying to say something which will impress the person they're asking the question, okay? There's a wonderful book written, which I recommend to you if you haven't read it already. Charles Lindblom wrote a book called Inquiry and Change. Anybody ever heard of the book? I'm disappointed. Okay. Anybody here a Clinton scholar at this university? Public policy?
Public service, so we don't do public policy.
Okay, all right, whatever you do. Okay, you should read that book. Okay, you should read his book called Politics and Markets, and then his book called Inquiry and Change. Okay, Charles Lindblom is a economist from Yale University, studied under a guy named Frank Knight, who was kind of an irascible, kind of conservative economist from the University of Chicago, but Frank Knight made sense. Okay, he was skeptical about anybody's ideology. Lindblom in the book Inquiry and Change makes this point that most of us do not know our interest until we try to get it. Because our interests are those things that we're willing to spend time and money and energy. Okay? So I will say to you, it's in my interest to be 50 pounds lighter. But if I don't cut my caloric intake to 1,600, if I don't walk 30 minutes a day, then it really is not in my interest. It's a wish, it's a hope, it's a dream. I want somebody, a genie, to intervene and just automatically transform me, okay, into a svelte young person, all right? Okay, so I've got to do, in order for it to really be my interest, then there has to be some evidence that I'm putting time and money and energy and effort in it. Then you can say that's in my interest. Now, the problem is there are no mechanisms in existence for most people to do that. So therefore, what we get is not their interest, but their preferences. And the neoclassical economists, anybody here a neoclassical economist so I can make fun of you? Are you one, sir? Did you raise your hand? Okay, the neoclassical economists, following the Bethamite calculus, utilitarian calculus of we're all pleasure-paying calculators of desire, they've taken the notion of preference and taken and used that to instead of interest. And so when they read The Wealth of Nations, or they quote Adam Smith, they never read The Wealth of Nations. When they quote Adam Smith and they talk about the invisible hand and self-interest, they don't know what the heck he's talking about. Because Smith was talking about our capacity to be able to be in sympathetic, his term, his David Hume's term, the Scottish Enlightenment's term, to be able to get inside of other people's situations. And he had this concept called the invisible spectator, okay, who could actually watch a transaction that goes on between two people and be in the other person's situation and context. So he said, it's not the benevolence of the butcher or the baker, but their interest that you can rely upon, okay? And it works like an invisible hand, which was a kind of a joke, because it really comes from Macbeth. When Macbeth sees Banquo close and he says, move this bloody and invisible hand. Anyway, I don't know if that answered your question or not.
Okay. Any other questions? Anybody else got anything? Yeah, there's a question right back here, sir. Wait, the microphone's coming at you.
Good afternoon, you all. My name is Monte Sadler. I go to Philander Smith College. I'm also a part of the Social Justice Institute Fellowship there. My question, as a young college student in undergrad, you said that power precedes program.
That's correct.
So I think my question is, as a young individual who doesn't necessarily have that power, how do we pretty much go about getting it?
Well, what I'd like to invite you to do is to learn how to organize, okay? And so come to one of our training sessions. We do them in Little Rock periodically, and be happy to teach you how to think about power. Power is the ability to act, okay? It's a relational concept. You can't have it by yourself. It's two or more people with a plan, okay? Two or more people with an idea. It's not 5,000 people, at a concert. It's people, you and I, coming together and then deciding that we need some other people, so we invite this young lady here and this gentleman over here, and we try to create a network of people who want to do something, and then we find another network who wants to do something else, and then we learn how to negotiate. We'll work with you on your issue, but you got to work with us on our issue. We start off slow, small, and then we build over time trust. And as we begin to build trust with each other, because we deliver for one another, it takes time, it takes effort, it takes energy, and it takes commitment. So if you really want to have power, you got to be willing to commit yourself to a relational culture, to building a relational culture, ideally connected to an institution. It doesn't have to be a church or synagogue or mosque. It can be a school, it can be a social network, it could be a neighborhood organization, but there has to be some institution which carries on the tradition. Alfred North Whitehead wrote an essay called The Aims of Education. And he said, the educated person is someone who understands tradition, which is the living ideas of the dead, versus traditionalism, which is the dead ideas of the living. Most of our schools in education teach the dead ideas of the living. We teach facts which are disconnected, unrelational, and there's no insight, no judgment, no commitment as a result of it. Read that essay. It's a very good, fine essay. The Aims of Education. No educator has read it, but they should, by Alfred North Whitehead.
All right.
Anybody else?
Any other questions? Yeah, Joe, right here. We'll come back there. Yes.
Oh, thanks. I would be interested in knowing the extent. I mean, I'm very interested in knowledgeable to a certain extent about your organizing principles. But I'd be interested in the extent to which you factor in regional culture, in teaching and coaching people. I'm thinking particularly of the Mid-South as a region, say, compared to a place like Northern Illinois or Oklahoma as distinctive regional cultures.
Well, I've spent a fair amount of time organizing in Louisiana, and you have to really be attentive, I guess is the best word, to the folkways, the moreways, the do's, the don'ts of the way people operate. Same thing. I mean, I remember we were working with some meat packing workers in Omaha, Nebraska, and the vast number of the workers were from Central America, and they were males. And we started organizing them around soccer because they played soccer, and they wanted lights for soccer fields. So we start off with the soccer fields, get the lights. They begin to trust us. They all go to Our Lady of Guadalupe Parish, and then we begin to organize. We hear their stories, find out what's going on in the workplace, find out that they have to wear diapers to work, because they only have a certain number of bathroom breaks, and so they essentially have to be incontinent, while they're assembling meat. So be careful where you buy your meat from, because and then there's not much safety experts in the meat packing plants. So we organized to get them bathroom breaks. We even get the governor of Nebraska, a Republican, to issue a Bill of Rights for workers, and then we try to partner with the food and commercial workers to help them build a union in Omaha, Nebraska. Food and commercial workers haven't been through our training, so they try to set up meetings with some of the women who work without first talking to their husbands. That's a no-no in a Central American community, where the male feels dismissed, and that's just, you're going to create a problem. But they weren't sensitive to that. Second, then the other problem they had was that the meetings had to be conducted in Spanish, and they were insecure about that because they were not Spanish speaking, some of the labor leaders. So they almost blew up the organizing drive because of their inability to understand that the leadership of the new local was going to be Central America and not white, not their color. So I don't know if that deals with you.
I thought you were going to go into Louisiana.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Much more, with native Louisianans, that would be, say, perhaps much more comparable to working with another Mid-South population, which certainly might have, there are lots of Hispanos in Arkansas, certainly, and I could see how that
Well,
meatpacking example would be
one of the things we
apropos.
learned in New Orleans
I'm
and
thinking
working.
of something else here.
I'm sorry. One of the things we learned in Baton Rouge was that the organization had to be led by African American pastors in the beginning, okay? And that we had to also organize separately white churches and congregations, and over time bring them together. We could not just clump them together. We learned the same thing in San Antonio, okay, where we had once we built a Mexicano organization, the whites left. We were trying to build a broad-based organization, but the whites left. So then we had to go back and organize them in a separate organization. They would not be part of the COPS organization because they saw it as brown and Mexican and Catholic. And they were fearful of that kind of organization. So we had to build a separate organization. And now we're building another organization in San Antonio of even more affluent Anglo folks, because again, even though they enjoy, they love going to COPS actions, they feel like that they don't have the space to operate in that kind of a situation. I don't know if that's addressing.
Let's thank Mr. Cortés. And I know there's more questions, so please come up and visit with him at the conclusion of the program. But thank you very much.
Okay,
it was
sure.
excellent. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah, so please come visit with me.